Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gina Smarecki. I am the events manager at Nuspire, and I'll be your host for today's live session. Today's webinar is always a popular topic as we look at Nuspire's threat findings from last quarter, and our analysts share the current trends in cybercrime. The full threat landscape report did go live this morning and is now available on our website. I'll go ahead and share the link to everyone in the chat in case you're interested, and go ahead. You can go ahead and download that. If you have questions during today's presentation, go ahead and submit them in the Q&A tab. We'll try and leave a few minutes at the end for your questions. Also, there's a different tab for the chat. Feel free to use the chat tab and let us know where you're joining in from today. And so everyone knows, you will receive a follow-up email in the next couple days to watch the recording of this session. So at this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today, Josh Smith and Justin Hurd. Josh is a cyber threat analyst at Nuspire who works closely in organizational threat landscapes, curating threat intelligence, and authoring Nuspire's quarterly threat landscape report. Josh is currently pursuing his master's degree in cybersecurity technology. Previously, he served with the U.S. Navy as an operations specialist with 14 years of service. Josh has been quoted in Forbes, CSO Online, Channel Futures Dark Reading, and others. And Justin is our Director of Threat Intel and Hunting. He works to develop and deliver intelligence at Nuspire. He has over 13 years of experience in cybersecurity and has developed methodologies and tools for industry-based threat modeling. Justin previously worked 6 years for a defense contractor as a security engineer and network administrator. And with that, now I will turn it over to Josh and Justin.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Gina. Good morning, good afternoon, from wherever you're checking in from, and thank you for joining us. As we talk today through our Q1 findings, first we're going to go over what is our methodology, how did we come about these things, and then we'll take a look at the actual data sets themselves. We have 3 different sections we'll cover. We have our malware section, our botnet section, and our exploit section. At the end of each one of those, Justin will step in and he'll give you some mitigations, some proactive things you can do with regarding those fields and those different threats and findings. Lastly, we're going to discuss an industry spotlight. It's something that we do in each one of our quarterly reports as we kind of rotate through different industries. This specific one we're going to talk about is the technology industry. And then lastly, we'll go back over and cover everything again with the conclusions and recommendations.
Hello, everybody. Excited to present this data to you today. Just going to go a little bit over the process and what we do to kind of collect the data. The data is gathered through all of the devices that we're monitoring. And so we take that data, we clean it up, we process it. We can use that data to trigger hunts, to prioritize what we should be hunting. We can use it to create detections. And then ultimately we can use it to distribute intelligence. So we can disseminate that intelligence. And this is a great example of that through the quarterly threat report, where we've aggregated, processed all that information into trends so we can identify what's going on, this quarter and maybe how things may change over the rest of the year.
So we start with our first section. We'll go ahead and discuss malware. Throughout Q1, we saw over 3 million events. And this was just shy of a 40% increase when we compare this against our Q4 data from last year. So when we look at the top 5 malware that we had detected throughout Q1, the top variant there being malicious JavaScript files. And they have taken over Microsoft variants, and we've started to see a big decrease on those. We'll discuss why here in just a couple slides. Specifically with JavaScript, is we've seen an increase in this activity. Likely this is attributed due to Microsoft and some actions on them. It was very popular for threat actors to use things like Microsoft Word and Excel files and embed malicious macros within there. It had been a trend for quite a while that threat actors had been doing. Microsoft took action against that by blocking those macros by default. It's really kind of painstaking now for someone to enable those. They have to go to the file, right-click properties, and the whole time it's screaming at them, this is a really bad idea. Don't enable this unless you know exactly where this file came from. So threat actors are having to shift their tactics as one of their primary methods have been taken away from them. So JavaScript is one of the things that they're leaning towards. Fortunately, a lot of email firewalls are really good at detecting this sort of stuff and can block it, but sometimes those things slip through. They can also go ahead and just create URLs and send malicious links out to people through email, creating different fake websites using different embedded JavaScript to basically capture end users' information when they input that, collect these credentials at this point, and further use them in brute forcing and pay and spray style attacks. And so as we saw a decrease in the Microsoft VBAs, the Excel variants, as I was mentioning there, we've seen this big decrease now after they implemented those restrictions against it. So we've started seeing some other types of emerging trends too, specifically an increase in OneNote files. OneNote files have become really popular with threat actors because there haven't been any restrictions put on that until April. So just last month, Microsoft really got a hold of this one quickly and blocked 120 dangerous file extensions from that. So again, now threat actors are forced to react to that and shift their tactics. And now what we're starting to see is some emerging threats with this quarter we'll be able to talk about next webinar, but really they involve around QR phishing and things of that. Sending a QR code in a social engineered email and enticing a user to scan that. In doing so, not only can the user not just visually see that that's a malicious thing, it's taking them out of the corporate environment, usually when they're scanning it on their phone, and there's not the controls like a web access firewall and things like that. They can then get sent to a malicious link and enter their username and password and basically have their stuff scraped at that point to be used in further attacks. So we'll be able to talk some more about that next quarter as we kind of get a wrap on how things go for the rest of the quarter. And I'll kick this back over to Justin to talk about some mitigations.
Yeah, so for these things, we really like to focus on the TTPs or the tactics that the attackers are using. As Josh mentioned, there's a lot of pivoting between what's easiest and then using other methods like JavaScript and the OneNote files as their previous used attack methods have stopped working. Endpoint protection platforms are really great at this. They look more at TTPs with the telemetry data that's provided inside of those systems that allow us to catch not just variants of malware, but the different tactics that attackers are using in order to infect machines. Network segregation is always a great tool. It's kind of one of our first lines of defenses is just making sure that we're using least privileges, segregating the network properly. So one organizational unit can't contact another one, and so we can at least minimize the amount of exposure we have to a different attack. And then cybersecurity awareness training is always great. As Josh mentioned, phishing, trying to get people to click links, open OneNote files, scan QR codes, so on and so forth, are just easy ways into the network. And so the way we can help mitigate that with our users is to create some awareness training around those things.
And as we shift over into our next section regarding botnets, there were over 1 million detections within Q1, and it's roughly about a 50% increase in activity when compared against Q4. So out of our top 5 botnets, Torpig MeBrute botnet, we've reported on this quite a bit. It's continued to dominate and be one of the top botnets. What we wanted to do, call out this time specifically, is we had 2 entries appear for botnets, specifically the net support, remote access Trojan, and fatal red botnets. So with the net support rat, we've been observing activity from this starting in March of 2023. And within just 1 month of this new activity we'd witnessed, it pushed it to our second highest observed botnet within Q1. Net support itself is a legitimate remote access tool, similar to something like TeamViewer, but it's being abused very heavily by cyber criminals. One of the reasons why they'll do this is because when someone is hunting or someone's building rules around it, at a quick glance, it looks like legitimate software and legitimate activity potentially. So different modified versions of these have been coming out and have been sold on dark web forums between these threat actors. And in fact, a new campaign did come out in 2023 specifically too, where these threat actors were using a fake Pokemon game to try to lure in anyone that would click onto it, in which case they would then take remote access of their computer. They were able to harvest credentials, install additional malware, or if they really wanted to, they could deploy ransomware. And so this is just another example, though, of a threat actor looking for legitimate tool sets to try to use those to be able to avoid detection. Then we look at Fatal Rat. Fatal Rat is another new one, as I mentioned, within our botnet sections that we've reported on. And it's frequently used by a threat actor group called the Purple Fox Threat Actor Group. They've been a threat and they've been around since 2018, and they often will take this Fatal Rat and retool it to try to bypass different security softwares. Utilize this, they can distribute different type of Trojanized installers that also mimic legitimate software. If you can see the theme, a lot of these threat actors like. And these Trojanized installers will appear as things like Telegram, Chrome installer, Microsoft, or say the Adobe stuff, Microsoft products, and WhatsApp. With the installation of that, they can then execute certain modules. They can decide which ones they want to install and which ones they don't want to install after they scan the victim's system to see what type of antivirus do they have. At that point, they can kind of figure out, yes, that antivirus will detect this part, but it won't detect these. So it's very modular, customizable to try to get around those different things.
And so to mitigation and response, we're talking about botnets. It's kind of those communication channels that attackers are using to either send instructions or send data back to their command and control. So one of the great ways to help mitigate and respond to these use of these communication channels is to leverage threat intelligence. So there's a lot of shared intelligence out there to collect about different IPs that have been discovered to be part of that infrastructure. And so that's a good way to mitigate and be able to respond to these communications. Same kind of thing here for next generation firewalls and antivirus. They have some built-in botnet command and control type of alerts and detections built into them, so that can kind of give us another layer to detect that activity. And then the last one here is threat hunting. So not only identifying those communication channels, but figuring out which devices they're talking to, and if they have successfully been able to infect that machine or do any harm to that device.
As we move over into the exploit section, we did see over 250 million detections within Q1. So it's over 150% increase when compared against Q4. I know the chart appears to show activity decreasing, but what we're really witnessing here is that initial surge of activity in January and that spike in February were so large that it pushed that total activity numbers way up. And a lot of this has to do with brute forcing activity and spray and pray attacks. We've seen some very large campaigns of that coming through, specifically during Q1, but we are starting to see that activity start to kind of normalize and come back to the standard baseline we've seen and reported against. And as I stated, brute forcing and spray and pray attacks have by far been some of the most popular things that we're seeing. If exposed ports and exposed services out there, threat actors are knocking on those doors and trying to find ways to get into them. If we peel back the brute forcing to try to be able to get an idea of what else is out there, Log4j, which came out in December, a couple years ago at this point now, continues to be a very popular exploit and still something that's abused. Now, something new that did come out throughout the quarter is roughly in mid-January, there was a brand new critical pre-authentication remote code execution vulnerability. This was identified in Zoho Managed Engine products, which included Service Desk and Endpoint Central, some very popular software. At the time of advisory, there was no signs of active exploitation, which was nice. But almost immediately afterwards, some proof of concepts begin to come out from the security industry as well as from threat actors, and immediately the activity began to pick up as that stuff started to circle throughout the internet. So what was nice about this too, though, was patches were available for this prior to the public disclosure of this threat. So it's another good reason to keep in mind that just because the vulnerability hasn't been announced, a critical vulnerability, it's still important to keep up on your patching, because they may have already patched your critical vulnerability and are trying to get in front of all of the stuff that's going to happen once that's announced. As soon as these things are disclosed, threat actors are opportunistic and they are motivated and they're looking to beat system administrators in the patch cycle. If there is something exposed that they can get a scan on it using very popular things like Shodan to go out and search for vulnerabilities, they're going to build themselves a list and they're going to begin these spray and pray attacks where they're just going to work their way through the list until they finally get the notification they've reached access into one of those systems. And then from there, they can begin to launch ransomware, exfiltrate data, whatever the mindset and motivations of that threat actor are. Another one that came out, we discussed this within Q4, but we witnessed this activity double for Hikvision products in Q1. This is also something that we had talked about right here at the end of the year as we moved into our predictions for what we would see this year, was an increase in attacks against IoT or Internet of Things devices. These are typically created as camera systems here. And a lot of times, depending on how those are configured, they can be exposed to the outside world as people want to be able to access these cameras on their cell phones. It can leave a gap in your security to have these systems forwarded out. So it's a good reason to have these things either behind a VPN or to segregate them on the network to not allow, if they're breached, any form of lateral movement from there. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the advisory board that talks to government entities, federal aspects about cybersecurity and sets the tone for what they can and can't do, advised that this particular vulnerability is a top threat for state-sponsored threat actor groups from the Republic of China. Additionally, on that list that they released, the Log4j that we had mentioned as one of the top exploits was also on that list. So they're still staying to some of these older vulnerabilities while hopping on top of some of these brand new, especially Internet of Things, things that are typically going to be exposed, because it gives them access into a network where they could start laterally moving and taking things over.
So when it comes to mitigations and response for exploits in general, the main thing here is to patch your system ASAP. As Josh mentioned, a lot of these vendors are sending out security patches, and we're not jumping on them right away. We're kind of waiting until it hits the news, and as soon as it hits the news, everybody finds out about it, as well as the attackers. And so, being opportunistic, they're going to jump on that exploit as well, and then it's a race to figure out, who's going to get it patched first. So the biggest thing here is patch your systems as soon as possible. Monitor the different security bulletins and news bulletins that you get from vendors that you're using. There are some signatures inside of your firewall that help protect against some of those exploits. So that's kind of a first line of defense for some of those things. And then the last one here is disabled unused services. If you need to run penetration tests, you need to look at vulnerability reports to understand where your exposure is. So if you have things that you're not necessarily using or don't need those ports open, you should definitely clean up those unused ports on your devices.
So as we move into our last section here for it, like I said, we talk about an industry spotlight, and this time we've around for the technology industry, which this covers a wide range of companies, including things such as IT services, software, telecommunications. And these are typically a prime target for threat actors due to their large user bases, their extent reach, and their access to people's data. So we saw an example in Q1, really of the first known double supply chain attack, which affected an organization called 3CX, which sells phone system software. One of their employees fell victim to a supply chain attack, which then gave them access to 3CX's network, which they launched another supply chain attack off of that. It was attributed to the North Korean threat group Lazarus. Once they had access into 3CX's network, they were able to easily laterally move throughout their network and reach their way into the development section of it. Once they were on the development side of the house, they created their own versions of 3CX's software and embedded malicious code into it and distributed it out to their clients as a legitimate update. At that point, we were right on the cutting edge of this and kind of saw a lot of this activity first starting to pop up. And there were a lot of different people that were reporting that their endpoint protection were initially flagging this update as being malicious. At the time, 3CX thought it was legitimate, and people were whitelisting these things, unfortunately, which then allowed further infection. So it's another good reason to keep in mind that just because an organization says that things are okay, if everyone's reporting that their security software says things are bad, there might be something going on there, and you may not want to just initially whitelist it to make it work. So ultimately, what does this mean? Organizations need to be mindful of what their third-party risk is. Specifically, what vendors do you have? What access do they have to your network if something happens to them? It's one of those things of where you need to have access controls and least permissions possible. Segregation within your network, again, is something that we've really thumped on a lot through here. Hold your vendors, to security certifications. Do they have the regulatory and industry standards, things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, GDPR, all these different standards? Are those implemented within their organization? You also need to make sure that your incident response plan specifically looks at third-party risk and looks at those different scenarios. So if a breach does happen from them, where can it get in your organization? How can you cut off access to save your data at that point? And then ultimately, you can use different things like threat intelligence, as well as different headlines, advisories, to be able to get an idea of if these things are starting to happen, and also to be able to assess potential risks that may come from different third-party vendors and your broader supply chain.
In conclusion here, overall, when we talk about malware and vulnerabilities and exploits, and botnets and different tactics and techniques threat actors are using, there's kind of a layered approach to this to help mitigate and catch these activities. The one, educate your users often. We talked about phishing, the OneNote, the QR codes, just different ways to trick your users into bringing malware into your environment. Taking a layered approach. So no one single technology is going to keep you from getting ransom or keep your devices from getting exploited. You're going to need a layered approach to that. And it starts, with network hygiene, having good policies and firewalls set up in place, and then working down the chain or working down the layers to figure where you can get more protection at. Patching your tech stack. The first part of that is understanding your tech stack. What vendors are you using? What technologies are you using? We haven't really talked too much about third-party risk, but we've seen a lot of attacks involving third-party exploits or vulnerabilities that are introducing holes in our environment. And so keeping track of those, watching those news. If people are talking about it, a lot of people are talking about it, there's probably something going on. So kind of keeping an ear out for some of those things. And when it comes to intelligence in general, we all work together. We have to work as a community to try to stay ahead of these things. And so that's just a great layer of information for you to add to your protection. Updating your malware protection goes along with patch management as well, just making sure everything's up to date. A lot of times there's signatures in place, there's patches out for vulnerabilities that we can grab. And then the last one is segregating high-risk devices. This kind of goes to the beginning part of identify what your high-risk devices are, having a plan if they are to get exploited is really important. So those are just some things that we can do to help protect our environments.
All right. Well, thank you both for sharing that latest and greatest threat report there. Always very interesting. If anyone does have any questions, we will have about 5 minutes left to go ahead and pop them into the Q&A tab. I would like to mention our next webinar, where we will be teaming up with our friends at Firemon to talk about how to avoid common firewall misconfigurations. I will go ahead and share that link in the chat box for anyone who may be interested in that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our actual threat landscape report that we just went through, the full report is now available on the website, which I also shared that link earlier in the chat to everyone here on the call. All right, let's go to questions. All right, so we have a question here. What are your go-to tools for delivering security services, and are you using XDR? Justin, you want to take that? Josh?
Yeah, I can take that one. So, there's no one particular tool. Obviously it starts, you have to collect the data, you have to understand. So having a good SIM solution, EDRs, we use a lot of SentinelOne, but we have clients that use CrowdStrike, Cyber Reason, Carbon Black, Microsoft Defender. So there's a lot of different technologies. I think it's less about the technologies and more about the processes. Having strong processes, understanding what you're trying to protect. But those are just a few things. So I'd say, primary SIM solutions, EDRs. You can start doing some automation with some SOAR and things of that nature. And then good firewall and good network hygiene is a good starting point for that.
All right, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Ed, for the question. All right, we have a question here for Josh. Out of all the threats out there, what's the one thing that keeps you up at night?
I would have said about a year ago, probably ransomware, but I would say with the way things have shifted here recently, probably supply chain attacks anymore. I know we just beat that up pretty good here, but there's a reason for it. Like I said, these threat actors know if they can breach into one of these larger companies that have multiple clients underneath them, they've got the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. And so I'd say those are the things anymore. Don't get me wrong, ransomware is still very much a major threat, but it's typically a single organization in that circumstance where supply chain attack, unfortunately, is a numerous amounts of clients that the threat actor is able to then get access to. So third-party risk is, I still don't really think it's a super hot topic within cybersecurity, but I think it's getting there. And I think it's starting to overtake ransomware as a lot of the bigger fears.
All right, awesome. All right, here's a question for Justin. What's the best way to get a vulnerability management program going?
Yeah, there's a couple, layers of that. So you can, just understanding your vulnerabilities, getting a vulnerability scan. There's lots of software out there that helps you get a handle on the different vulnerabilities that are in your environment. And then, what the applicable patches for them are, where they're at. There's another layer of that which you can layer on a service to basically help you not only identify those vulnerabilities, but help you in the patching process. And so there's kind of layers to that. But the first layer would be, vulnerability scan, understanding where your vulnerabilities are, and then moving maybe into some type of automation for patching, just so it's done, quickly. Because, I think it was number one of the vulnerabilities and exploits is patch your systems as soon as possible. And we all know that can be very difficult when you have, multiple systems all over the place, and you have to figure out downtimes and things like that to get these things updated. So some of those different applications can help you with that.
All right, and I'm sure Nuspire could help anyone out there that may need help getting that going. So just reach out to us and we can at least probably point you in the right direction. Thank you, Justin. I don't see any other questions, and we are just right about time here. If anyone comes up with any questions for our team here, please go ahead and email us at webinars@nuspire.com. I can route those to the correct person here at Nuspire, or you can always contact us through our website at nuspire.com. Any closing thoughts from either of you, Josh or Justin?
Like Justin said, I think my closing thoughts would be patch your stuff as soon as you can. I know it's really easy to say from the security side and not from the operation side, but that's definitely it. So many of these things can be prevented just by patching.
Yep, for me, I just want to thank everyone for joining. It's always great to be able to share this information, and hopefully you guys find it valuable and it helps you be more secure.
All right. Well, on behalf of Nuspire and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.